All right, and now time to discuss this a bit further, the ongoing current troubles in the Islamic world. Dr. Sreeram Chaulia, a Professor and Dean of the Jindal School of International Affairs, joining us live from India. Good to see you today. As I'm sure you were just listening to our correspondent, Paula Sliya. She's in Cairo, certainly talking about the regional aspects there of the tensions that have ultimately eased compared to the ongoing violence elsewhere. Do you think the Muslim Brotherhood's decision to call off the mass protests had an effect?
Certainly, they are in power, and we have seen recent weeks that they have asserted themselves over the military, and I think that they will have a calming impact. And also, remember, Egypt is applying for IMF loans and Western financial aid right now, and it cannot really antagonize the United States too much. So I think the Brotherhood will try its level best. But remember, the Salafists and the ones who are said to be actively engaged in fanning the protests are not entirely under the Brotherhood's control. So Egypt, as you know, is very fragmented, the political space, and the extreme Islamists, I think, will continue to try to whip up the crowds and the rage and the anger and direct it against the United States. And people remember that the United States was not on the side of revolution. And so there is a lot of pent-up anger against the United States because it had tried its level best to keep Mubarak in power.
Well, as you say, I'm sorry to jump in, but as you mentioned, though, certainly officials in Cairo are looking for more Western aid coming in now with this new fledgling government there. But it must be quite difficult, though, for the role of the local political figures in Cairo when trying to control this anti-Western backlash. Here they are looking for more funds from the West. At the same time, it's possible that some of these Egyptian politicians maybe sympathise with the very people they're trying to say, stop protesting and go home.
That's right. I mean, it would be unimaginable in the ancien regime's time for these kind of protests to have been even allowed. So certainly there is an anti-American vein and strain throughout the Egyptian polity, and that is being reflected in these protests. Local leaders, they will have to try their best, but I'm afraid the Salafis are not entirely amenable to the Brotherhood's advice. So the Salafis, as you know, have outside support. So they're local, but they're also proxies in many ways of Saudi Arabia and Qatar. The same people who are stoking the violence in Syria unfortunately have a hand here too. So I see this as, in many ways, an extension of the proxy war that's going on in Syria, where Salafists and extreme fundamentalists have been unleashed in the name of toppling the Assad regime. The same Salafis are now manifesting themselves in a violent and reactionary manner to a cranky film that should have been ignored in the first place. You talk
about this violent reaction and this aggression that we're seeing, not just in Cairo, but all over the world at the moment. It might seem bizarre to some that the Muslims find this film that mocks the Prophet Muhammad, they find it offensive, and then they walk out and hold protests where some of their own people are being killed in the violence. Doesn't that seem a bit bizarre?
Well, it is definitely politically motivated. I think, the protests we're talking about in Australia and far-off countries, which are away from the epicenter of the Arab Spring region, I think those are more spontaneous. But Libya, Egypt, Yemen, these are like post-revolutionary societies, and this is where we have seen the brunt of the violence, and the scale of the protests have been rather high. And I think these are politically orchestrated by local actors who are being backed by some of these rich donors from these Gulf monarchies who are also behind the attempt to overthrow Assad in Syria. There is a connection between all these. You cannot, separate grain from chaff. We need to look at, all of it together right now.
But you say there are some, perhaps political agitators or actors, as you call them, who are trying to stoke the violence. I mean, that certainly may be true in some areas. I don't think we can say that for the global violence that we're seeing in so many different parts of the world right now. However, I must ask you, do tell me and all of our viewers as well, do you think the violence that has been rising now throughout the week, do you think it's peaked, or is there more to come?
Well, the Friday prayers, as you know, in the Islamic world are very, very critical for mass mobilization and for arousing mobs. Now that the Friday is over, I would think that, it's going to plateau. But then you never know. If you remember the Danish cartoons during the war on terror, they went on for a long time. And I think even though the war on terror is now officially over, the war in Afghanistan is still on. So I'm not surprised that, United States is being made the target of the ire of Muslims around the world, even though the US government had no hand in making this hate film itself.